The net came up heavy, a dead weight that fought against the whirring winch. It was a familiar fight, the usual argument between man and the bounty of the gray, indifferent sea. But this was different. There was none of the thrashing, living protest of a full catch of mackerel or cod. This was a dense, inert mass, a singular object that shifted with a disconcerting solidity within the mesh. Elias, a man whose face was a road map of every squall he'd ever weathered, squinted against the salt spray, his gloved hands guiding the net over the gunwale. He expected a tangled mass of seaweed, perhaps a waterlogged log, the usual detritus the ocean occasionally coughed up. But as the net slumped onto the deck, a dark cylindrical shape rolled out, stopping against a coil of rope. It was a jar, a large glass jar, its color so deep a blue it was almost black, and it was sealed, perfectly sealed. It was an impossibility, a piece of deliberate human order adrift in the vast chaotic randomness of the North Atlantic. Elias had been a fisherman for 40 of his 58 years. The sea was his first language, its moods his constant companions. He knew the feel of a coming storm in the ache of his bones, the promise of a good day in the sharp, clean scent of the morning air. His boat, the Sea Serpent, was an extension of himself, a small, sturdy vessel that smelled of diesel, fish, and damp wool. His life was a cycle of tides and seasons, a routine as predictable and as powerful as the moon. He was not a man given to fancy or to mystery. The world, for Elias, was a practical place. You worked, you ate, you slept, and you did it all again. The ocean was a workplace, not a source of wonder. That's why the jar was so profoundly strange. The sea gave up treasures, but they were always smoothed, eroded, and changed by their time in the depths. A piece of sea glass, a shard of a ship's hull, a water-worn bottle. But this was pristine. It was an artifact, not an accident. It felt like it had been placed there, a deliberate message in a bottle waiting for a specific recipient, and the wrong man had just answered the call. A faint unease, a feeling akin to trespassing, began to prickle at the back of his neck. He left the jar where it lay for the better part of an hour, finishing his work, checking his lines, and keeping one eye on the horizon as the sky began to bruise with the approach of dusk. But his attention kept returning to it. It was an intrusion on his world, a silent, dark question lying on his deck. Finally, with a sigh that fogged the cold air, he knelt beside it. The glass was cold, shockingly so, and thick. He ran a calloused thumb over its surface, feeling the imperfections, the tiny bubbles trapped within the ancient glass. The seal was the most remarkable part. It wasn't a simple cork or a modern screw top. It was a disc of dark red wax imprinted with the faint, elegant silhouette of a bird in flight, a heron perhaps. It was a marvel of old-world craftsmanship, a promise of integrity, a barrier against the relentless press of the ocean. He knew, with a certainty that defied logic, that whatever was inside was meant to stay dry. Getting it open would be a violation. The thought made him hesitate, but the curiosity was a stronger, more primal force. He found a heavy, flat-headed screwdriver and a small hammer. The first tap of the hammer against the screwdriver's head echoed in the quiet of the encroaching twilight. It was a sharp, cracking sound, the sound of a lock being broken. He worked the edge of the screwdriver under the wax, prying gently. The wax resisted, then gave way with a brittle sigh flaking off in dark red crumbs. Beneath it was not a cork, but a plug of lead, sealed to the glass with some kind of black tar. It was a fortress. He had to work the screwdriver around the edge, twisting and prying. His breath held tight in his chest. With a final loud pop, the plug came free. A puff of air, ancient and dry, escaped from the jar's mouth, carrying with it a scent that was not of the sea. It was the smell of old paper, of vanilla and something else, something faintly floral like lavender long since faded. The moment the seal was broken, the atmosphere on the boat changed. The tension of the physical struggle was replaced by a deeper, more profound suspense. Elias peered into the dark opening. Inside, coiled like a sleeping serpent, was a roll of paper, tied with a piece of what looked like faded velvet ribbon. He reached in, his fingers brushing against the brittle, dry edges of the paper. It felt impossibly old, fragile as a moth's wing. He eased it out, the roll feeling lighter than it should have, as if it held no weight but the weight of its own history. He carefully untied the ribbon, which disintegrated into dust at his touch. The roll wanted to stay curled, holding the shape of its confinement for decades. He gently, reverently, began to unroll it on the flat, worn surface of a wooden crate. The paper was thick, Creamy vellum yellowed at the edges where a few drops of seawater had breached the wax seal, but the core was miraculously preserved. The first thing that caught his eye was not writing, but a drawing. It was a simple, elegant rendering of a constellation, a cluster of stars drawn in dark, confident ink. He recognized it immediately, though he hadn't thought of it in years. Cygnus, the swan, his grandmother, a woman who had looked at the night sky not as an expanse of darkness but as a storybook, had pointed it out to him countless times as a child. "That's the swan, Elias," she would say, her voice a soft whisper in the night. "It flies forever down the river of the Milky Way, looking for its lost love." The memory, so vivid and unexpected, hit him with the force of a physical blow. Beneath the drawing, the writing began. The ink was a deep faded brown, the handwriting a flowing feminine script that spoke of a bygone era of penmanship and patience. It wasn't a letter. It was a series of fragments, a journal entry written in a hurry or perhaps a code. The first line was a date, October 12, 1943. The next line was a name and address. "For my Lena, 24 North Star Point if this ever finds you." But the name Lena was crossed out with a single decisive stroke. Below that, a phrase that made no sense. "The tide turns at midnight. He doesn't know about the boat." Then a set of coordinates written with painstaking precision. 44 dig 31 195 N, 63 dig 34 12 4W. Elias's heart began to beat a little faster. He knew those coordinates. Every fisherman in this part of Nova Scotia knew them. It was a location called the Graveyard of Ships, a notoriously treacherous reef system a few miles offshore, a place to be avoided, especially at low tide. Why would anyone write this down? Why send a message to a place that didn't exist, as North Star Point had been washed away in a storm 50 years ago? He continued to read, the fragments becoming more desperate. "The locket is all I have left. It's in the tin. They think I'm going to the city. I'm going to the sea. Forgive me." The final entry was just a single haunting sentence, underlined 3 times. "The stars will remember when the stones have forgotten." Elias sat back on his heels, the brittle vellum held carefully in his hands. The wind whipped around the cabin of the sea serpent, and for the first time in his life, the vast, empty ocean felt crowded. It was filled with the ghosts of a woman he'd never met, a lost love, and a secret that had been waiting, sealed in glass for him to find. The note wasn't for him. It was a message from a past he had no connection to. Yet as he looked at the drawing of the swan, at the coordinates of the reef, he felt a chilling, inescapable pull. The note wasn't for him, but it was telling him where to go. The night folded in around the sea serpent, a thick, heavy blanket of cloud that snuffed out the stars. The sea, which had been merely restless, began to show its teeth, the swells growing larger, more purposeful. Elias sat in the small cabin, the brittle vellum spread on the table before him, the single lamp swinging gently with the motion of the boat. The practical part of his brain, the part that had kept him alive for 4 decades, screamed at him. It was a fool's errand. Chasing a ghost story into a reef known for swallowing ships whole on the eve of a storm was the act of a madman. He should secure the boat, head for the shelter of the harbor, and forget the jar, the note, the woman with the desperate handwriting. But another part of him, a part he hadn't listened to since he was a boy sitting on his grandmother's knee, was whispering a different story. It whispered of the swan, flying down an endless river, of promises made under a canopy of stars. The drawing of Cygnus was not just a picture, it was a key, unlocking a door in his memory to a time when the world was full of magic and possibility. The coordinates on the page were not just numbers, they were a destination. He looked out the cabin window at the churning black water. The storm was coming, yes, but the note had been written on the eve of a storm too. The tide turns at midnight. He wasn't just following a map, he was following a pattern. With a resolve that felt both insane and utterly right, he started the engine. The sea serpent turned its bow away from the safety of the shore and pointed itself towards the graveyard of ships. The journey was a descent into a world of gray and black. The sky and the sea merged into a single churning entity. The horizon erased. The rain started, not as a gentle shower, but as a sudden stinging curtain of cold water that lashed against the cabin windows. The wind, which had been a moan, was now a howl, a mournful cry that seemed to carry voices from the past. Elias steered by instinct and by the glowing green numbers on his GPS, the modern technology a stark contrast to the ancient mystery he was pursuing. He felt a strange sense of calm, a feeling of being guided. The boat rose and fell on the massive swells. a cork in a cauldron, but he was not afraid. He was a man on a mission, a courier for a message 70 years late. Every wave that crashed over his bow, every gust of wind that threatened to push him off course felt like a test, a challenge from the sea itself. As he neared the coordinates, the sea grew even more violent, the water breaking over unseen rocks just beneath the surface, white foam churning in the darkness like ghosts. This was it, the graveyard. According to every chart, every fisherman's tale, there was nothing here but death. He cut the engine, letting the boat drift in the chaos. The coordinates on his screen matched his position perfectly. He scanned the tumultuous sea with his powerful searchlight, its beam cutting through the rain and darkness. There was nothing, just angry, heaving water. A wave of disappointment, cold and sharp, washed over him. He had been a fool. It was just a story, a sad, fragmented tale that had led him to his own grave. He was about to turn the key and fire up the engine to make a desperate run for it, when his light caught something. It wasn't a shipwreck, it was a flicker of something different, a change in the texture of the coastline on his port side. He swung the beam back, holding it steady. It was a gap, a narrow, almost invisible fissure in the towering black cliffs of the coastline, a place where the sea exploded with fury. It was an entrance to something, a hidden cove or inlet, a place so small and treacherous it wasn't on any modern chart. It was a place only someone who knew these rocks intimately, someone who had been here before, would ever find. The tide turns at midnight. The tide was low, exposing just enough of the submerged rock at the entrance to make it passable, if you were brave or stupid enough to try. He wasn't just following coordinates, he was following instructions. With a deep breath and a prayer to any god that would listen, he engaged the engine, using short, precise bursts of power to nudge the sea serpent into the maelstrom. The waves crashed against the cliffs on either side, sending plumes of spray high into the air. It was the most dangerous maneuver of his life, a tightrope walk over a watery abyss. For a heart-stopping minute, he was engulfed in the roar and the spray, his world reduced to the spinning compass and the feel of the wheel in his hands. And then, as suddenly as it began, it was over. The boat shot through the narrow channel and into a space of profound, impossible calm. The cove was a perfect circle, sheltered by the towering cliffs on all sides. The storm raged outside, a distant muffled fury, but in here the water was as still and dark as a mirror. It was a sanctuary, and there, nestled in a small, sandy beach at the edge of the cove, half buried in the shingle, was the skeletal remains of a small wooden boat, its ribs bleached white by the sun and salt. This was the boat from the note. He anchored the sea serpent and waded ashore, the cold water a shock to his system. The remains of the boat were little more than a framework, but beneath one of the thwarts, lodged securely in a crevice of rock, he saw it, a small square tin box, corroded by the sea but still intact. It was exactly as the note had said. He pried it open with the edge of his knife, the metal groaning in protest. Inside, wrapped in what was left of an oilcloth, was a small heart-shaped locket. His hands trembled as he unfastened the tiny, rusted clasp. It opened with a faint click. On one side was a miniature portrait, painted on ivory, of a woman with dark, intelligent eyes and a determined set to her jaw. It was her, the woman who had written the note. He could feel her spirit, her desperate hope, radiating from the tiny image. He turned the locket over, and his world stopped. On the other side was another portrait, a young man in a naval uniform, his face strong and proud, a faint, confident smile on his lips. It was a face he knew better than his own. It was the face of his own father, in his 20s, years before Elias had even been born. The shock was a physical blow, a punch to the gut that stole his breath. The note wasn't for a stranger. The story wasn't just a story. It was his. As the full, terrifying weight of this realization crashed down on him, the storm outside chose that exact moment to unleash its full fury. The wind howled like a wounded animal, and a wave larger than all the others crashed over the entrance to the cove, sending a surge of water towards the beach. He looked from the locket in his hand to the raging storm outside, and a single chilling thought pierced through his shock. The note hadn't just led him to his past. It had led him to the only safe harbor in a storm that would have torn the sea serpent to pieces out on the open sea. The note wasn't for him, but it was, in that very moment, the only thing keeping him alive. The storm raged outside the cove, a deafening symphony of violence, but inside, Elias was trapped in a silence more profound than any he had ever known. The locket felt like a shard of ice in his palm, its two tiny faces staring up at him, one of a stranger, one of his father. The man in the portrait was so young, his eyes full of a hopeful, confident fire that Elias had only ever seen in faded photographs. This was not the quiet, weathered man who had taught him to tie knots and read the tides, a man whose love was expressed in gruff nods and the silent sharing of a thermos of hot coffee. This was a man who had secrets, a man who had lived a life so separate from the one Elias knew that it felt like a betrayal. The wind howled, and for a moment, it sounded like a woman's weeping. He closed the locket, the click of the clasp a tiny, insignificant sound against the fury of the storm. He was safe from the wind and the waves, but he was adrift in an ocean of questions that was far more terrifying. The night stretched on, an eternity of darkness and noise. Elias huddled in the small skeletal remains of the boat, the locket clutched in his fist. He replayed every conversation he'd ever had with his father, searching for a clue, a hint of this other life. But there was nothing. His father had been a man of the present, his gaze always fixed on the horizon, on the next catch, on the practicalities of survival. Elias had always interpreted his quietness as a lack of depth, a simple man's simple mind. Now he saw it for what it was, a fortress, a wall built so high and so thick to contain a grief so immense it would have otherwise drowned him. The woman in the locket, Ilara, was not just a lost love. She was a ghost who had sat at their dinner table every night, an unspoken presence that had shaped the very air Elias breathed. As the first gray hint of dawn began to seep into the sky, the storm's fury began to abate. The howling wind softened to a mournful sigh, and the crashing waves subsided into a gentle rhythmic lapping against the shore. The world outside was slowly coming back to life. Elias knew he couldn't stay. He had to leave this sanctuary, this tomb of secrets. But before he did, he had to know more. The locket was the heart of the mystery, but it wasn't the whole story. Driven by an instinct he couldn't explain, he began to search the small cove more thoroughly. He scanned the base of the cliffs, his eyes tracing the dark, wet stone. And then he saw it. A narrow fissure, almost completely hidden by a curtain of ivy, a few feet from where the boat's remains lay. It was a place of perfect concealment. He pushed the ivy aside and peered into the darkness. The opening was small, but it was there. He squeezed through, the cold, damp rock pressing in on him. The space inside was not a cave, but a small, dry hollow, just large enough for a person to sit. And on a small, flat ledge of rock, someone had made a home. There was a small, burnt-out circle of stones from a fire, and next to it a small, oilcloth-wrapped bundle. His heart hammered against his ribs as he reached for it. He unwrapped the oilcloth, his fingers fumbling with the stiff, waxed fabric. Inside was a small, leather-bound journal, its cover swollen and warped from the damp air, but intact. This was it. This was Ilara's voice. He sat on the cold stone floor of the hollow, the journal open on his lap, and began to read. The handwriting was the same as on the note, a flowing, desperate script. The first entries were full of a young, intoxicating love. She wrote of meeting his father, Thomas, at a dance in the town hall. She wrote of their secret meetings in this very cove, a place she had discovered as a child. She called it their kingdom by the sea. She described his laugh, the way his eyes crinkled at the corners, the promises he made under a canopy of stars. He says the sea is in his blood, she wrote, but he says my name is the tide that pulls him home. Elias felt a painful tightening in his chest. This was the language of a love so pure and all-consuming it was its own force of nature. But as he turned the pages, the tone began to shift. The war came. Thomas enlisted. The entries became letters addressed to him but never sent. I wait for your letters like the shore waits for the moon, she wrote. They are the only thing that keeps the darkness at bay. Then the letters stopped. Her entries became shorter, more frantic. It has been 3 months since his last letter. I hear rumors. They say his ship was damaged. They say nothing at all. The final entry, dated a week after the date on the note in the jar, was a raw, open wound. He is not coming back. I saw his name on a list today. Not a list of the dead, but a list of the returned. He is back. And he is married. Married to a girl from the North Shore. A girl with a family, a future. He chose a different life, a different shore. Our kingdom is just a cove of rocks now. I am leaving this place. I cannot stay here, breathing the same air as him, knowing he is not mine. I will leave the locket here, in our boat, with this journal, a message in a bottle for the sea. The stars will remember when the stones have forgotten. Goodbye, my Thomas. Goodbye. Elias closed the journal, the weight of its story settling upon him with an unbearable finality. This was the climax, the emotional impact that shattered his world and then remade it. He looked at the locket in his hand, at the portrait of his father. He didn't see a traitor or a cad. He saw a young man, a boy really, who had gone to war and seen hell and who had come back broken and desperate for a simple, predictable life. A life without grand passions, without kingdoms by the sea, without a love so intense it could destroy you. He had chosen Elias's mother, a good, gentle woman because she represented safety, a return to the shore, and he had carried the memory of Ilara, not as a betrayal but as a sacrifice. The silence, the stoicism, the constant staring at the horizon. It was all a penance. It was the price he paid for the peace he had chosen. Elias understood with a clarity that brought tears to his eyes that his father had loved him with a quiet, fierce love, but he had loved Ilara with a love that had defined his entire soul, and he had never been able to speak of it, not once in 50 years. The tears flowed freely now, hot and silent, a release not of sorrow, but of profound, earth-shattering empathy. He was finally seeing his father, truly seeing him, for the first time. Outside the storm had passed. The sun was rising, casting a golden, gentle light into the cove. The world was new, and so was Elias. The sun climbed, spilling liquid gold across the surface of the now placid cove. The storm had passed, leaving behind a world washed clean, the air sharp and clear. Elias sat for a long time on the sandy shore, the journal in his lap, the locket resting on its open page. He felt a profound sense of peace, a quiet stillness that settled deep in his bones. The anger, the confusion, the sense of betrayal, it had all been scoured away by the storm, leaving behind a bedrock of pure, unadulterated understanding. He was not the son of a simple, quiet man. He was the son of a hero, a man who had made the ultimate sacrifice. He had sacrificed the grand passion of his youth for the quiet, steadfast love of his family. He had chosen a life of silent penance to protect the world he had built from the ghost of the one he had lost. With a reverence that felt sacred, Elias carefully closed the journal and the locket. He could not take them with him. This cove was their kingdom, their tomb. He walked to the skeletal remains of the boat and placed the journal and the locket back inside the tin box, returning them to the crevice of rock where they had waited for him. It was an act of closure, a final goodbye to a love story that had ended before he was born. He was leaving the past to rest, but as he turned to leave, his eyes fell upon the blue glass jar, lying where he had left it on the shingle. That was different. The jar had not been part of their story. It had been the messenger that had delivered it to him. It had crossed an ocean and 70 years to find him, to save his life and to give him back his father. He picked it up, its smooth, cool surface a comfort in his hands. He would take it with him. It was his story now. The journey back to his home harbor was a pilgrimage across a transformed sea. The water was a deep, placid blue, the sky a vast, empty canvas. The sea serpent cut through the water with an effortless grace. Elias steered with a light touch, his hands no longer fighting the wheel but guiding it, in concert with the gentle swells. The sea was no longer an adversary. It was a confidant. He felt a connection to it he had never felt before, an understanding of its dual nature, its capacity for immense violence and for profound, life-giving calm. It was the same as his father. He thought of the man who had raised him, the man who had taught him how to read the sky and the water, and he understood that every lesson had been a form of love, a way of passing on a hard-won wisdom. His father had given him the practical skills to survive on the ocean, but in his silence he had also given him the space to discover its deeper mysteries for himself. The story of Ilara was not a secret that had been kept from him. It was a truth that had been waiting for the right moment, the right tide, to be revealed. When he finally docked the sea serpent in its familiar slip, the world felt both the same and completely different. The gulls cried, the bells on the buoys chimed, the smell of diesel and salt hung in the air. But Elias saw it all with new eyes. He was no longer just a fisherman, a man defined by his work and his routine. He was an heir to a legacy of love and loss, a keeper of a story that was as vast and as deep as the ocean itself. He took the jar back to his small, cluttered house, a house that now felt like a museum of a life he was only just beginning to understand. He placed it on the kitchen table, the centerpiece of his world. He spent the afternoon cleaning it, using warm water and a soft cloth, gently wiping away the grime of its long journey. As the glass cleared, it began to catch the light, throwing prisms of blue and green around the room. He looked at his own reflection in the curved surface, his face distorted, older but with a new clarity in his eyes. He saw his father's face in his own, not as a stranger, but as a part of him. The jar was no longer just an object. It was a mirror, a lens through which he could finally see his own history. The story was complete. The note had found its intended destination not in a person, but in a soul. That evening, as the sun set, casting a long orange glow across the water, Elias sat at the table, a cup of hot coffee in his hands, just as his father used to do. He found himself staring at the wax seal, the one he had broken to get to the note. It was the heron, wings outstretched in mid-flight. It was an elegant, distinctive image. A faint, distant memory stirred in the back of his mind, a half-forgotten image from his childhood. He got up and went to the small cedar chest in the corner of the living room, the place where his mother had kept all of his father's personal things. He hadn't opened it in years. He lifted the lid, the scent of cedar and old wool filling the air. He rummaged through the contents, old fishing licenses, a worn-out wallet, a few black and white photographs, and then, at the very bottom, he found it. A small, flat, leather pouch, tied with a leather thong. He had never seen it before. He untied the thong and emptied the contents onto the table. It wasn't a letter or a photo. It was a single, thin strip of cured leather, like a tag for a key or a luggage label. It was blank on one side. On the other, branded into the leather with a hot iron, was a single, unmistakable symbol, a heron, wings outstretched, in mid-flight. Elias stared at it, his heart beginning to pound a slow, heavy rhythm. His father hadn't just been the recipient of a message in a bottle. He had been a part of the network that sent them. The story of Alara wasn't a unique tragedy. It was one thread in a vast, secret tapestry of stories, carried across the seas in jars just like the one on his table. He looked from the leather tag in his hand to the glass jar on his table, a question forming in the quiet of the room. Who were they? And what other secrets were they sending adrift on the tides of time? He was not just the recipient of a message. He was a link in a chain,